The story of the 7-Foot brothers began as most rural tragedies do, in the quiet that follows disaster. The flood of 1886 tore through the western edge of Missouri like a punishment that spring. Whole farms were stripped from their roots, livestock drowned where they stood tethered, churches split from their foundations. When the waters receded, they left behind a land altered not only in shape but in memory. Along the eastern banks of the Osage, near a settlement then known only as Deepwater Crossing, a cellar was found, half exposed by erosion, its timbers protruding from the mud like ribs of some buried beast. The sheriff's men who descended into it would later say the air below still carried the smell of rain and iron, and though the flood had washed away the brothers' farmhouse above, what remained beneath the earth told a story that would take decades to unearth and never fully to explain. The brothers were known to the county by the name Gant, though few agreed on whether that was truly theirs. Some said they came from Kansas before the war, others claimed Tennessee. They were men of unnatural height, each above 7 feet, broad-shouldered, quiet, and almost gentle in manner. Their mother, a widow named Clara, had died early, leaving them the homestead and a reputation for hard labor. By all accounts, they were neither cruel nor kind, just men shaped by work and silence. They ran a cooperative crafting barrels for whiskey traders who moved product downriver. Folks said they rarely came to town except for salt and nails. No one thought much of them, until women began to vanish from the road that ran between the floodplain and the timberline. The first missing was a peddler's daughter in the summer of 1884. She had been traveling with her father's wagon from Clinton to Warsaw, selling textiles and tinctures. When the storm came, they took shelter near Deepwater. By morning, the wagon was found turned on its side, wheels sunk in clay. The father unconscious, his face marked by what he claimed were claws. He remembered hearing voices calling through the rain, deep voices laughing low, then the sound of dragging. His daughter, 19 years old, was gone. The sheriff's search turned up nothing but a length of torn ribbon and a boot heel near the Gant property. The brothers allowed the men to search their fields. Nothing was found, and the case was left to rot like so many others in that lawless corner of the state. But vanishing has a way of repeating itself in the same soil. Over the next 2 years, 26 women disappeared within a radius of 10 miles, most during storms, most last seen near the Osage or the low road that curved toward the Gant farm. Farmhands claimed to have seen lanterns moving in pairs at night, as if some midnight harvest was underway. Children told stories of hearing singing from underground. But this was Missouri frontier country. Poverty was common, superstition cheaper still. No one could afford to chase ghosts. Only when a preacher's niece failed to return from delivering food to a flooded homestead did the county stir itself to action. The preacher, a man named Reverend Langley, gathered 10 men and rode through the storm to the Gant property. They found the house locked, windows blackened. No one answered their calls. The men, half drunk on fear and whiskey, broke the door. Inside, they found no living soul, only wet footprints leading toward the trap door in the kitchen floor. The cellar beneath was not a root cellar at all, but something built with a precision far beyond what poor farmers could afford. The walls were lined with limestone blocks, the floor covered in packed clay. At the far end stood a row of iron doors like those of old ice houses or meat lockers. What lay behind them was never officially recorded in full. The coroner's notes, what little remain, spoke of multiple remains in stages of disarticulation, of female subjects, numbering beyond immediate count, and of implements inconsistent with agricultural purpose. The sheriff's report was sealed that spring, and the property burned within the week. The men who had found the cellar took to drink, to silence, or to leaving the county altogether. Those who stayed spoke of noises coming from the ashes when the wind passed over the ridge. When the rains came again in March of that year, they unearthed what the flames had missed: fragments of bone, lengths of cord, and metal shackles coated in rust. The flood had peeled back the earth like old wallpaper, revealing the hidden architecture of human cruelty. Yet the Gant brothers themselves were never found. Some said they drowned when the river rose. Others believed they fled north, blending with the railway crews. A farmer claimed to have seen them months later, walking through the fog with their heads bowed, carrying something between them wrapped in canvas. Another swore one of them had been shot and buried near the old crossing, though no grave was ever marked. What remained certain was that their cellar became a kind of wound in the landscape, one the county tried and failed to close. In later years, survivors, if that word could even apply, would come forward from neighboring towns. Women who spoke of being lured by offers of work or shelter during storms. Their stories were fragmented, fevered, dismissed as hysteria. They described waking in the dark, hearing water drip, feeling walls of stone that swallowed sound. They spoke of voices singing hymns distorted into low murmurs and of the smell of whiskey and smoke. One woman said the brothers were building something beneath the ground, something meant to hold the lost. Whether she meant bodies or souls, no one asked. She was sent to the state asylum in St. Louis the next month and died there before her testimony could be recorded. By 1890, the Gant name was erased from census rolls. The land redistributed to new settlers who built their homes on higher ground. The cellar collapsed during another flood, sealing itself with mud and rock. Yet the legend endured, evolving into the kind of tale that parents told to keep daughters from traveling alone. Preachers folded it into sermons about sin and secrecy. The Gant brothers became symbols of what the wilderness hides when it grows too close to man. And still, on stormy nights, travelers along the old Osage Road claimed to see lights flickering where the house once stood, as if someone below was still tending their work. To historians, the case sits between folklore and file. It is too detailed to dismiss, too fragmented to confirm. Court records from 1886 list an inquiry into mass disappearances of female persons, but redact every name. The official explanation remains flood casualties. Yet even that could not explain why so many personal effects, lockets, combs, and fragments of clothing were later found in the fields long after the water receded. The cellar became the unspoken symbol of what Missouri wanted to forget. That isolation, when left to rot, grows its own monsters. In the century since, the story has persisted in whispers carried by archivists, folklorists, and the rare traveler who dares to follow the Osage Bend where Deepwater once stood. Locals say that when thunder rolls across those plains, the ground trembles in rhythm, as if echoing footsteps from below. Some claim that if you press your ear to the earth, you can hear faint knocking, metal on stone, steady and patient, as though the cellar beneath still remembers the work it was built to do. The rains came hard that spring, heavier than any in living memory, and the Osage rose like a thing unbound. Whole orchards vanished beneath the brown water. Bridges groaned and gave way. The farmers of Deepwater Crossing spoke of it afterward as if it were a visitation rather than a storm, something sent to cleanse the land, or to reveal what it had long concealed. When the floodwaters drew back, they left behind a plain of twisted fence wire and scattered bones, both animal and otherwise. The Gant homestead, built low on the bend where two creeks met, had all but dissolved. Only the cellar mouth remained, a pit yawning open where the ground had split. The first men to find it were laborers clearing debris. They were not lawmen or preachers, only tired men with shovels who thought they were digging for fence posts until the soil began to exhale a stench so dense it seemed to crawl into their mouths. What they uncovered, plank by plank, was not merely a cellar but a structure built to last, a chamber laid in stone, too deep, too deliberate, its timbers cut smooth as though by a craftsman who had meant for it to endure long after the world above had gone silent. The authorities came 3 days later, the sheriff leading a party of 12. They descended with torches, the air below still damp from the flood. At first they thought it an ice house, the kind used for storing meat through summer. Then they saw the hooks along the beams, the rings embedded in the walls, and the pits dug at the far end of the chamber. There were no coffins, only shapes curled and half buried in silt. The coroner's notes would later describe remains in abundance, though the true number was never officially stated. What struck them most was the order of it all. Bones arranged, heads turned to face a single direction as if in prayer. On the western wall, etched faintly into the limestone, were marks that no one could read, half symbol, half tally. Some believed they were counting something. Others said it was the brothers' way of measuring what they had taken. When word reached Jefferson City, the case was buried as swiftly as it had been unearthed. Missouri in the 1880s was a land eager to forget. It was rebuilding after war, after plague, after the thousand small violences that came from trying to civilize wilderness. The story of the 7-foot brothers did not fit into the new order being built along the rail lines and river ports. Newspapers printed only fragments. Farmhouse destroyed, remains discovered, flood blamed. But among the locals, the legend began to gather shape. They said the brothers were not born of woman, but of storm, that their mother Clara had been struck by lightning in her 7th month and lived long enough to bear giants. They said the boys grew without speech until age 10, that they fed on raw corn and bark, and that their father's death, if there ever had been one, was never properly accounted for. Such stories were the language of grief in those days. People made myth to soften what history refused to explain. There were letters, though, written in the years before the flood. Letters from women seeking employment, responding to notices posted in county stores. Help needed. Room and board, fair wage, sewing and domestic work, addressed to G. Gant, Deepwater Crossing. Some of those letters survived in the county clerk's archive, the ink faded but legible enough to reveal the same pattern. The writers were widows, travelers, girls with no family to claim them. One spoke of leaving the orphanage in Springfield. Another mentioned her hope to earn money enough to start anew. None were heard from again. Their correspondence was found bundled in oilskin among the debris near the creek, tied with a length of hair ribbon. Whoever had saved them had done so carefully as if collecting something sacred. The people of the county, pressed by fear and shame, burned what they could. The remains were taken to a shallow grave on the church hill, marked only by a wooden cross that fell within a year. The cellar was sealed with stone and mud. Yet the ground there never settled right. Each spring the floods returned, washing away the topsoil, revealing again what had been buried. It was as if the earth itself refused to keep their secret. Travelers began to report odd sounds along that stretch of river. Hammering from beneath the banks, a low hum that rose and fell with the wind. Men who camped nearby swore they woke to find their lanterns extinguished, and the ground beneath them warmed to the touch as though something still lived below. The sheriff, weary of chasing superstition, ordered the site fenced off. But fences rot, and stories never do. By 1890, the land had passed into new hands. A farmer from Sedalia bought the property cheap, ignoring local warnings. He built a small cabin on higher ground, planting corn where the Gant house once stood. His wife lasted 2 seasons before leaving, claiming the soil whispered when plowed. She said she could hear the cries of women when the rain fell hardest, as if the storm itself carried their voices back. The farmer stayed another year, then vanished. His mule was found wandering the road, the wagon intact, the plow left half buried in the field. In his cabin, a single word was carved into the doorframe: below. For the rest of the century, Deepwater Crossing became a place people passed through but never stopped. The railway bypassed it, the church closed, and the land grew wild again. Yet the legend of the brothers endured, retold by drifters and travelers in every form the imagination could shape. Some claimed the Gants were not murderers but undertakers. For the flood, men who gave rest to the drowned when no one else would. Others said they were collectors, obsessed with the idea that the soul could be trapped and stored like whiskey in a barrel. The cellar, they believed, was a vault for such things, its iron doors built to hold not bodies but something far more elusive. Historians, when they returned to the story decades later, saw in it the outlines of the era's cruelties, the exploitation of women, the collapse of frontier law, the lingering shadow of war. The brothers became archetypes, symbols of the violence bred by isolation and loss. The flood merely exposed what had been festering long before, the rot beneath the moral order of small towns clinging to survival. The missing women were not victims of legend, but of circumstance, unprotected, unseen, their disappearances swallowed by a landscape too vast and a society too willing to look away. In that sense, the Gant cellar was less an aberration than a mirror. Yet the land has a way of remembering what the record will not. In 1918, during a drought, a group of boys playing near the old creek found fragments of pottery and a rusted locket bearing initials that matched one of the letters preserved by the clerk. The discovery reignited old whispers. A reporter from Kansas City traveled down to write a feature called The Giants of Deepwater, Fact or Fable. He left 2 days later without filing his story. Locals said he'd gone white as milk after visiting the site, claiming he heard hammering from beneath the stones. His notebook was found years later among his effects. The final line read, "Some doors were built to stay shut. Even now, the site resists settlement. Surveyors claim their instruments fail near the old foundation. Compass needles spin, ground. Moisture defies prediction and the soil yields nothing but clay and bone." The state placed a marker there in 1962, a small plaque that mentions only the flood and the unidentified remains of 1886. It says nothing of the brothers, nothing of the cellar, nothing of the 26 who vanished. To name such things, perhaps, would be to awaken them. And so the land is left to hold its own silence. A silence deep and heavy, pressed into the earth like a secret too large for any one generation to bear. Those who live nearest say that on nights when lightning crawls across the river and thunder rolls like iron, you can see the ground shimmer where the cellar once was, as though something beneath still breathes. They say the storm does not come to Deepwater Crossing. It rises from it, climbing up from the soil that remembers too much. Some stories insist the brothers are still down there, preserved by the clay, waiting for the next flood to set them free. Others believe they never left at all, that the cruelty which made them was not washed away but inherited, passed through the blood of those who stayed. Whatever the truth, the land remains, holding both the horror and the hush, both the record and the forgetting. By the turn of the new century, Deepwater Crossing was nothing but a name on yellowed county maps, a ghost line fading beneath the ink of progress. The land that once trembled with the weight of the Gant brothers' legacy had begun to swallow itself. Cottonwood and sumac took the edges of the old fields, and the river, now tamed by levees and bridges, had shifted its path away from the cellar grounds. To the casual eye, there was nothing left but a mound in the tall grass, half collapsed and overgrown. But for the few who still remembered, the quiet there was too deliberate, too heavy. Travelers sometimes stopped to rest by the riverbank and remarked that the air changed near the site, as though the sound of the water dulled, as though even the wind refused to cross it. They left quickly, unsure why. The story of the 7-foot brothers had faded into folklore, but the land still held the resonance of something unfinished, something buried beneath human forgetting. There were those who tried to bring the story back into daylight. In 1904, a state geologist named Dr. Simon Fairbanks came to the area under the pretense of studying flood patterns. He had an interest in anomalous soil formations, and his journals, preserved in fragments in the Missouri Historical Society, suggest he knew more of the Gant legend than he admitted. Fairbanks spent 3 weeks surveying the lowlands, drawing sketches of the limestone strata and the drainage channels cut by the old creek. In one entry dated June 17th, he wrote, "The earth beneath the former homestead yields a constant warmth, though there is no mineral deposit to explain it. My compass fails here. The locals advise against digging, not out of superstition but out of memory." 2 days later, he noted hearing a hollow percussion at dusk, as if hammer upon stone, though no worker is present. Fairbanks left Deepwater Crossing abruptly before completing his survey. His assistant returned alone to St. Louis, saying only that the doctor had taken ill. His body was never found. It was around this time that a series of disappearances, quiet ones, never formally linked, began again in neighboring towns. 2 washerwomen walking home from the Clinton station vanished after a thunderstorm. A widow who lived alone near the Osage Bend was found drowned in her well, though her body bore no sign of struggle. A traveling seamstress, last seen taking the back road through Deepwater, never arrived at her destination. These events, spread over years, never reached official inquiry, Yet in the back rooms of taverns and the corners of church suppers, people began to whisper that the brothers' curse had ripened again. They said the cellar beneath Deepwater was breathing, that the floods which once drowned it had only sealed something living inside. They said it was hungry, What terrified them most was how the pattern repeated. The storms always came first, those sudden tempests that rolled over Missouri without warning, breaking the heat and flattening crops. And always after the thunder quieted, someone went missing. By the third case, locals began to mark the connection. Storm, silence, disappearance. A farmer named Hodge, who lived nearest the old property, claimed to have seen lights under the earth. Not lanterns, he said, but a glow that came from within the ground itself, like lightning trapped beneath. His wife begged him not to speak of it. Saying such things drew attention from the wrong corners of the spirit world, but Hodge insisted on telling the sheriff, who rode out the next morning and found nothing but the smell of wet soil and iron. Within a week, Hodge and his wife had vanished, their house door left open to the rain. Years passed, and the world outside moved on. Railroads carved new routes, towns grew from timber to brick, and Missouri began to call itself modern. But Deepwater Crossing never rebuilt. By 1920, even the Church Hill was overrun, the grave markers long since taken by floods or neglect. Yet the legend persisted, finding its way into print through a generation of amateur historians hungry for the strange. One such man, a schoolteacher from Kansas City named Ellery Crane, published a slim volume titled The Giants of the Osage, Tales of the River Dead. In it, he collected local accounts, letters, and rumors, treating them as fragments of a lost epic. He suggested that the Gant brothers had been part of a larger cultic movement, a sect that believed salvation could be achieved by returning flesh to the clay. Crane's book sold poorly and was denounced by the county historical board as sensationalism, but within months of its publication, the author himself was found drowned in his study. His pockets were filled with mud, though there was no sign of forced entry or flood. The police called it suicide. To the people of Henry County, the story ceased to be about guilt or justice and became instead about inheritance. Every generation retold it differently. Some swore the brothers were merely misunderstood, their cellar a workshop of crude science rather than sin. Others insisted they were avatars of the land itself, giants shaped from Missouri mud returned to claim the lost. The facts eroded, but the fear remained constant, settling into the blood of those who stayed. Children born in that region were taught not to walk the floodplain after dark, not to sleep near open water, and never to ignore the smell of iron when rain begins to fall. The few scholars who later examined the surviving documents found patterns that reached beyond folklore. Court ledgers from 1886 mention a shipment of industrial limestone delivered to Deepwater Crossing, though no official construction was ever recorded. Ledger books from nearby foundries list orders of iron fittings and bolts under the initials GG. When adjusted for inflation, the costs suggested a project far larger than any farmhouse needed. The cellar then may not have been the crude hideaway of two backwoodsmen, but a calculated structure, one built to contain, preserve, or perhaps conceal. Yet who financed such work and for what purpose remains a question lost to the mud. By mid-century, when the last witnesses of the flood had died, Deepwater Crossing existed only in maps and memories. The state began building a highway through that part of Missouri, and in 1952, construction crews cutting through the old valley unearthed fragments of limestone wall. The foreman halted work immediately, believing it part of an old foundation, but when a backhoe struck metal, the earth collapsed into a void. The cavity beneath was roughly 20 feet deep, its walls lined with the same cut stone described in 1886. The state police sealed the site before the press could arrive, citing unsafe geological conditions. The men who entered that chamber never spoke publicly, but one, a young engineer, left a note for his wife that was later found after his death. They are still standing. No one ever learned what he meant. The site was paved over, the highway rerouted slightly to avoid the unstable ground. Travelers driving that stretch today pass within yards of where the cellar once opened its mouth to the flood. They see only trees and pasture, unaware of the weight beneath their tires. But truckers tell of radios that go dead there, of headlights flickering when storms roll in. Some say they feel a tremor, like a slow breath rising from under the asphalt. State reports attribute it to subsidence, a shifting of old river channels. Yet those who know the land's history cannot shake the thought that something older than erosion still moves below. In the decades that followed, Deepwater Crossing became the kind of story that slips between folklore and geology, half believed, half denied. The 7-foot brothers became less men than metaphor, giants of guilt and secrecy, reminders of what happens when a community buries its sins rather than confessing them. But there are always a few who seek the truth not for redemption but for understanding. In the 1970s, a group of local historians returned to the site with ground-penetrating radar. They found anomalies, rectangular voids extending deeper than expected, as if the cellar had not collapsed but branched outward. The data was inconclusive. Funding dried up. Their notes mention echoes detected by the instruments, pulses of vibration too rhythmic to be random. The project was quietly abandoned. Those who have walked that land since describe it as beautiful in its desolation. The river, narrower now, curves lazily through fields of wild rye. The air smells of clay and watercress. Yet when storms gather, the light changes. The sky takes on a copper tint and the horizon shimmers as if heat were rising from the ground itself. In those moments, old-timers say, you can almost see them. 2 enormous figures standing in the downpour, faces turned toward the earth, waiting. Whether they are ghosts or memories or the shape of the story itself does not matter. What matters is that Missouri remembers, even when its people do not. The cellar remains unseen but enduring, its silence deeper than any river, its walls holding the echo of 26 names spoken only by the wind. By the early spring of 1982, a different kind of flood began to move through Missouri, not of water but of memory. The state archives in Jefferson City initiated a rural restoration project, cataloging forgotten counties and lost homesteads. Among the files rediscovered was an 1886 ledger of the Deepwater Township. It was brittle, its pages streaked with what looked like ash and clay, but between its lines were faint traces of names. Gant, twice repeated. The archivist, a young woman named Rebecca Cole, noted that the handwriting changed mid-entry, as though one clerk had started and another had finished hurriedly. She brought the ledger home to study, and in her notes, later found among her estate papers, she wrote that she could smell the soil of the floodplain when she touched its pages, a metallic dampness that no preservation method could remove. Rebecca was not a superstitious woman. She approached history with the calm patience of a restorer, piecing together events not for sensationalism but for truth. Yet she found herself drawn to the Gant brothers' entry, circling back to it nightly. The entry read simply, "Property assessed at 48 acres, riverfront, containing stone structure beneath dwelling, unfinished." But beneath it, in faint graphite, were the words, "Not for habitation." The phrasing intrigued her. No record explained why a family would construct a cellar, not for habitation. She began visiting county courthouses, tracing the property's transfer history. No deed of sale existed after 1886. It was as if the land had been erased from Missouri's legal memory. Her curiosity led her to Deepwater's old coordinates, now overrun by scrub and silence. She described her visit in her field notes. The air is heavy and there is a subtle sound beneath the wind, a hum almost too low to hear. The ground sinks unevenly toward what must have been the cellar mound, a depression like a throat swallowing sunlight. She took soil samples, sent them to a university lab, and received an analysis that left her unsettled. The sample contained abnormally high traces of phosphorus and calcium, levels consistent not with agricultural runoff, but with human decomposition. The lab assistant, unaware of the legend, joked that she'd probably dug near a cemetery. Rebecca didn't respond. She went back twice more, taking photographs this time. In the last roll she developed, the frames showed blurred streaks of light cutting across the ground, though she swore no such glare had been present. When her report reached the Missouri Preservation Board, it was quietly dismissed. Too speculative, they said. The data couldn't confirm anything beyond soil instability. Yet within weeks, Rebecca's correspondence grew erratic. Letters to colleagues described waking to the smell of wet limestone, hearing distant knocks in her apartment walls during thunderstorms. She confessed to a friend that she dreamt of standing in waist-high water, watching tall figures move beneath the surface, their hands brushing her calves as if guiding her toward something. Then her writing stopped. In June of that year, her car was found abandoned near the Osage Bend, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. No trace of her was ever found. No trace of her was ever found. Locals in Clinton County told the same story in whispers, that she had gone down to talk with the tall men. The phrase resurfaced decades later in oral history projects, where residents still spoke of the tall men by the river, a term that blended myth and fear. Some described them as spectral guardians. Others said they were the brothers themselves, condemned to walk until every soul they took was named. Each retelling shifted details, but all agreed on one rule. During storms, the river was theirs. The Deepwater legend took on new life in the 1990s, as local filmmakers and amateur historians began mining rural archives for dark Americana. One documentary, The Cellar Below the Storm, attempted to reconstruct the brothers' lives through dramatized accounts and interviews. It aired once on a public television channel before being pulled, allegedly due to viewer distress. Those who saw it recalled an ending that didn't match the broadcast summary. Grainy black and white footage of an excavation crew lowering a camera into a sinkhole, the feed distorting as if submerged. For a few seconds before the static cut, shapes appeared, too large, too symmetrical to be roots. The footage was later said to have been misplaced, though some still claim bootleg copies circulate privately among archivists. In 2003, a flood struck the region again, the worst since 1886. The Osage River broke its banks, reclaiming parts of the old Deepwater Valley. When the waters receded, they revealed something strange: smooth stone surfaces where no foundations should have been, marked by circular rust patterns like old metal fixtures. A state hydrologist, Dr. Martin Poe, documented them, noting that the formations were too uniform to be natural. He described finding a circular depression 12 feet across, filled with silt but lined with fitted limestone blocks. A central column rose from its middle, capped by iron. The report went unpublished. Dr. Poe resigned 2 months later and moved west. What the public did learn came from a brief mention in a local newspaper. Historic limestone structures exposed by floodwaters near former Deepwater Township. State authorities to evaluate site safety. Nothing more followed. Yet farmers nearby spoke of things the papers didn't print, of cows found drowned in shallow creeks with no visible injuries, of dogs refusing to cross certain stretches of pasture, of a sound beneath the earth that grew louder before rain. One old man claimed that on the night the flood crested, he saw 2 figures walking along the river ridge illuminated by lightning. They weren't ghosts, he said. Too solid, too heavy. Each step shook the mud like thunder. He wouldn't speak of it again. By now, the legend had shed all traces of its origins in mere crime or superstition. Scholars and folklore departments began interpreting it symbolically, an allegory of settler guilt, or a story of masculine power warped by isolation. Yet, to those living closest to the land, such explanations rang hollow. They didn't need metaphors. The earth itself seemed to insist on something literal. They could feel it underfoot. The slow pulse of moisture through clay, the subtle tremor when storms gathered over the Ozarks. It was as if the cellar still breathed, a lung of the drowned century refusing to die. There are patterns that human history repeats without realizing it. In 2011, during the bicentennial exhibitions of Missouri statehood, curators debated including the Gant brothers' story in a display about folklore of fear. They decided against it, fearing it would sensationalize rural poverty. But while the exhibit ignored Deepwater Crossing, one visitor did not. A historian named Daniel Avery, researching 19th century flood management, stumbled upon Rebecca Cole's archived correspondence. Her notes fascinated him. He traveled to the region, mapping the floodplain with modern equipment. Using aerial lidar scans, he detected a series of linear anomalies beneath the soil. Parallel trenches converging toward a single depression, roughly where the cellar would have stood. The pattern resembled a rib cage. Avery submitted his findings to the university press, but before publication, he was contacted by state environmental authorities. They requested all his data, citing groundwater safety concerns. He complied. His paper never appeared. 3 months later, his car was found submerged in a retention pond near Warrensburg. Investigators ruled it an accident caused by brake failure. The coroner noted an unusual detail. Despite being underwater for days, the vehicle interior was dry. The deaths, the silences, the lost papers, each might have been coincidence. Missouri's soil swallows evidence easily. Floods erase what memory tries to hold. Yet across decades, a rhythm persists. Every 30 to 40 years, a storm of exceptional force passes over the Deepwater Valley, and with it comes some reminder, an unearthed stone, a vanished traveler, an archivist who looks too closely. It's as though the land keeps calling names, refusing to be forgotten. The cellar beneath that ground has become more than a place. It is a threshold, a wound that never closed. Today, the site lies under a quiet stretch of pasture owned by a corporate farm. Satellite maps show nothing unusual, but pilots flying low after rain have reported a strange sheen on the fields, a pattern that appears only when the ground is saturated. 2 elongated shapes side by side, the size of men lying end to end, facing downward. Scientists say it's a quirk of drainage. Others say the tall brothers still mark their place, visible only when the world grows wet enough to remember. Those who live near Deepwater Crossing keep their distance from that part of the valley. They've learned the old rituals through repetition. When the thunder begins, windows are latched, doors are bolted, and every light is left burning. The old-timers whisper to the younger ones, "Do not look toward the river when the storm is walking." No one needs to explain what that means. It's not religion, it's survival. The cellar has no calendar, no conscience, only a hunger that time cannot dilute. And so the story endures not as a tale of evil, but of recurrence. How the sins of one age ferment beneath the soil until another age disturbs them. The Gant brothers were men of their time, shaped by isolation, by the arrogance of strength, by a century that buried its cruelties in plain sight. Whether they were murderers, madmen, or merely symbols carved from the clay of memory no longer matters. What matters is that the land remembers what people try to forget. And in Missouri, where the rain falls heavy and the rivers never stop shifting, remembrance is a dangerous thing. By the turn of the 20th century, the Deepwater Valley had faded from maps, but not from memory. The region had become farmland again, its story folded into rumor and prayer. Yet every few decades, something small and unsettling surfaced, an artifact, a whisper, a reminder that the past does not stay buried in Missouri soil. In 1908, a farmer named Amos Lillard was plowing near the Osage when his mule stumbled over something hard beneath the dirt. He knelt to dig it out, expecting stone, but uncovered a rusted iron latch attached to a hinge still set into the earth. The hinge, when he unearthed it fully, was fixed into a block of limestone, carved smooth, hand-hewn. The piece was too heavy to move, so he covered it back up and built his fence around it. The next month, his eldest daughter vanished during a thunderstorm. Her shoes were found in the mud a mile from the house. Lillard left Missouri by winter. People called it coincidence, but in that part of the country, coincidence had a particular weight. Families carried their histories like burdens. Storms were spoken of as living things. By 1915, the legend of the 7-Foot brothers had merged with flood stories and folklore about restless spirits. The Gants became mythic, a warning told by firelight. Travelers passing through would hear the same refrain at boarding houses. "Don't linger near the Osage when the water's high. The cellar still breathes." Historians from St. Louis dismissed such talk as frontier superstition, but they underestimated how the land itself could keep memory alive. When railroads cut across Missouri's interior, they unearthed bones near Deepwater Crossing, mostly animal, but some human. A work foreman sent a box of these fragments to the University of Missouri's anthropology department. The crate arrived, damp and unmarked, and when catalogued it was recorded simply as mixed remains unknown context. Years later, those bones would be used for comparative anatomy classes, passed from one student to another, their origin unspoken. One of those students, decades later, became a coroner in Henry County. When he retired, he wrote a letter to a local newspaper, claiming that certain long bones in that crate had been disproportionately elongated, more than any I've ever seen in a human skeleton. The editor never printed it, or printed it. By 1927, Missouri faced another great flood. The Osage and its tributaries broke from their banks, swallowing barns and drowning entire herds. In that flood, a small church near the edge of the Deepwater Valley collapsed. When rescue crews arrived, they found that beneath the church had been an older foundation, stone walls forming a circle, still intact despite the destruction above. Inside were markings that no one could decipher, symbols scratched deep into limestone resembling tally marks or prayers. The discovery made local news for a week before being overshadowed by larger stories from St. Louis. Yet in nearby towns, it reignited the whispers. Old men in taverns said the church had been built over the brothers' cellar, and that the markings were the record of what they'd done, each line a life taken. During the 1930s, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, employed historians to document rural folklore. One of them, a woman named Helen McCready, traveled to Deepwater to collect oral histories. Her surviving notebooks, now in the state archives, are sparse but telling. She wrote that the residents she met refused to say the brothers' name aloud. Instead, they referred to them as the Long Ones. An elderly woman told Helen that her grandmother, a midwife, had once delivered a child at the Gant homestead before it burned. Said the floorboards sang when you stepped, the woman recalled, like the ground was hollow, like it knew. Helen's notes end abruptly after that interview. Her last entry reads, "They say it still rains heavier here. Feels like the sky remembers. After World War II, industrial farming came to the Osage Valley. Land was leveled, drainage systems dug, and old property lines erased. Bulldozers occasionally struck stone foundations buried too deep to chart. Workers complained of engines stalling near the bend, of compasses spinning. A few reported headaches, dizziness, or the sensation of being watched from below. Company memos referred to these incidents as geological interference. They avoided digging deeper, not for fear but for cost. The Gant farm disappeared beneath modern infrastructure, its boundaries mapped only in ghostly overlay between surveyor grids. But human stories are stubborn. In the 1950s, a schoolteacher in Clinton included the legend of the 7-foot brothers in a local history lesson. She told her students how isolation could twist decency into darkness, how storms made monsters out of men. That night, the teacher's house was struck by lightning and burned to its frame. Her neighbors swore they heard laughter in the thunder, low, resonant, echoing from the river. For months afterward, townsfolk avoided mentioning the story. Some histories they decided were better left unsaid. By the 1960s, Missouri's folklore societies began compiling oral accounts of regional hauntings. The Gant Cellar was among them, a footnote in a larger compendium on rural American myths. But unlike tales of ghost lights or phantom trains, this one had physical evidence: maps, bones, reports, names. A few researchers pushed to investigate the site archaeologically, but funding never came. The area was privately owned by then, and the family who farmed it refused entry. "You dig too deep," the patriarch said in a rare interview. "You might find something that's still breathing." A generation later, in 1986, the 100th anniversary of the cellar's discovery, the Osage flooded once again. This time, the deluge unearthed fragments of the past: rusted metal, warped planks, and a small iron hook. Journalists descended on the county, eager to revive the legend. They interviewed farmers, pastors, and descendants of the original settlers. One elderly man whose grandfather had been part of the search party in 1886 spoke reluctantly. He said they didn't find bodies, he murmured. They found shapes, like the river had carved people out of clay and the clay wanted to be men. The clip never aired. The reporter quit within the year. As the 20th century waned, the Deepwater legend transformed from cautionary tale to local identity. Ghost tours sprouted, trading authenticity for spectacle. Tourists came to see the cellar of the 7-Foot Brothers, though no one could point to where it truly lay. Trinkets and postcards appeared in gas stations, crude sketches of two tall silhouettes against lightning. But beneath the parody, the story's truth remained like a bruise. Every few years, someone went missing near the Osage during storms. A hiker, a hunter, a camper. Always alone, always when the river swelled. Search parties found footprints too large to match any known person. They led into the mud and vanished. Anthropologists argued that the brothers' story survived because it gave shape to fear itself, a way for isolated communities to speak of violence and grief without confronting their own culpability. But in private, even skeptics admitted unease. In 1998, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, lightning struck near the old floodplain, revealing what appeared to be a pit, where water drained faster than the ground could absorb it. The next morning, a teenager who went to photograph the site was found unconscious beside it, muttering incoherently. When he awoke days later, he claimed he'd seen faces in the mud, all looking up. His story circulated briefly online before being dismissed as hysteria. Yet his camera, recovered nearby, had melted, its film fused into a single opaque strip. In the 21st century, researchers equipped with radar imaging returned to Deepwater, under the guise of environmental survey. They found cavities beneath the surface, shaped too geometrically to be natural. One chamber, nearly 20 feet wide, appeared to have a central support pillar, precisely what old records had described. Yet when drilling crews attempted to lower sensors, the equipment failed repeatedly. One technician later said he heard metallic knocking echo through the borehole, steady as heartbeat. His colleagues laughed it off. Within a week, he quit the project. Time may have erased the farmhouse, the brothers, even the flood, but it has not erased the cellar's gravity. It still pulls at the imagination, and perhaps at more than that. Every few years, a storm of unusual violence passes through the valley. Locals describe lightning striking the same patch of land over and over, as if drawn to something magnetic beneath. They say thunder echoes differently there, slower, rounder, as though it's answering. The rational mind says coincidence, but those who live closest don't argue. They simply wait, listen, and hope the ground stays sealed. History is less about what happened than about what refuses to stop happening. The 7-Foot Brothers of Black Hollow, of Deepwater Crossing, of the Osage. They were real men once, recorded in ledgers and remembered in whispers. But over time, their story became the land's own confession, a testament to what the wilderness can hide and what men can become when no one is watching. Every thunderstorm across Missouri's floodplain is a reminder that water remembers shape and earth remembers pain. Beneath that field, something built by human hands may still endure, waiting for rain heavy enough to make it breathe again. By the spring of 2007, the Deepwater story found its way into the modern consciousness not through books or broadcasts, but through the internet, small blogs devoted to vanished places and American hauntings. One such blog, written by a graduate student from Columbia named Henry Talbot, began as a harmless catalog of abandoned structures across the Midwest. His post titled The 7-Foot Brothers Cellar, Missouri's Forgotten Horror drew unexpected attention. Within weeks, readers flooded the comments with family stories, alleged sightings, and photographs of the Osage Valley after rainfall. Many of the images showed nothing remarkable, but a few captured something unsettling: mist rising from ground that wasn't warm enough to steam, indentations shaped like footprints too large and too deep to belong to any human passerby. Henry treated the story as myth at first, amused by its persistence. Then one night in June, he received an email with no subject line and a single attachment: a black and white image of what looked like a subterranean chamber. Waterlogged with a tall, indistinct silhouette near its center, the sender's address traced back to a public library computer in Clinton, Missouri. He never found out who sent it. The following month, Henry visited the valley to see the site for himself. He wrote that the landscape seemed uncomfortably still, as if the air itself was listening. He parked near the old levee and walked until he found a stretch of land that matched the descriptions from 19th century records. A slight depression, littered with broken limestone and shards of rusted metal. He took photographs, recorded ambient sound, and collected soil samples for analysis. That night, while reviewing his footage in a motel outside Warsaw, he noticed something strange. Faint rhythmic sounds beneath the audio of the wind, too slow to be machinery, too even to be thunder. It was a deep, hollow repetition, 5 beats, a pause, 5 beats again. He posted the clip online, joking that maybe the brothers are still making barrels down there. Within days, the post went viral. Viewers debated whether the sound was doctored. A few said it reminded them of distant hammering. Henry's blog grew into a minor sensation. Paranormal investigators, amateur historians, and tourists flooded the area, trampling through farmland that still carried the scars of old floods. County officials quickly fenced off the region, citing safety concerns. Henry was ordered to take down his footage under a state regulation about unauthorized environmental disturbance. He refused, arguing that he was documenting public history. 2 weeks later, his apartment was broken into. Only his hard drives and notebooks were taken. No other valuables were touched. He filed a police report, but nothing came of it. Months later, he stopped updating his site altogether. Friends said he'd become paranoid, convinced he was being followed by men who walked too slow, like they were conserving movement. He moved to Colorado and stopped talking about Missouri. By then, the Cellar had transformed once again, from myth into contested evidence. News outlets approached the story as both curiosity and cautionary tale, how folklore could fuel obsession. Yet even skepticism couldn't erase the unease that followed every retelling. The Missouri Historical Society attempted to reclaim control of the narrative, releasing a statement that the Gant brothers' story was without verified archaeological basis. But within the same year, a construction crew working 30 miles east struck an underground void during pipeline installation. When floodlights were lowered into it, they revealed fitted limestone walls and a corroded iron ring set into the floor. The crew foreman, interviewed anonymously, said the air that came up was so cold and foul that it burned the lungs. The site was quickly sealed, and state geologists were called in. Their report described it as a natural karst cavity with historical debris. Still, the workers refused to return. One man quit the following day, saying he'd heard breathing from below as they filled the hole. Around this time, an independent researcher named Linda Garvey began compiling every known document tied to the deepwater cellar: court records, coroner notes, and oral testimonies. She discovered that multiple counties along the Osage held unfiled missing persons reports dating back to 1884, many of them never transferred to state archives. Their handwriting, though written decades apart, shared uncanny similarities, as if copied from the same original ledger. Linda traveled to each courthouse, photographing every page, until her camera roll contained over 100 separate cases, all involving women, all vanishing near river crossings, all unresolved. In her private journals she wrote, "It's not one story, it's many wearing the same face. The brothers were only a beginning." Her work caught the attention of a documentarian who planned to adapt her research into a film. She agreed reluctantly, but just before production began, Linda withdrew completely. She told colleagues she had seen something that made the story close itself. Her notes ended there. She died in 2015, her papers sealed by her estate. Modern Missouri treats Deepwater as a void of both geography and conscience. Maps still show the area, but few roads lead to it. Travelers who pass the valley describe it as oddly featureless. Grass too uniform, trees too symmetrical, as if the land is remembering a shape it once held. During heavy rains, drainage channels overflow even when no nearby water source should exist. Locals refer to it simply as the low ground. Children are told not to play there. A farmer who grazed cattle near the old levee reported that the animals grew skittish before storms, gathering at the farthest corners of the property. When asked why he kept the land, he said quietly, "You can't sell what doesn't end." In recent years, environmental agencies studying flood control have run into strange anomalies around the Osage Basin. Ground-penetrating radar shows subterranean chambers where no geological formations should be. Some appear collapsed, others intact. When probes are lowered, their sensors record pressure shifts inconsistent with soil density. Engineers describe it as like breathing earth. Subtle expansion and contraction as if something below moves with the weather. Officially, the data is labeled as groundwater fluctuation. Unofficially, one hydrologist remarked, "It feels like the river itself is alive down there." The Cellar story, once an isolated tragedy, has become a lens for Missouri's haunted relationship with its own history. Folklorists now frame it as a metaphor for buried violence, the unspoken crimes of frontier life, the exploitation of women, the secrecy of rural poverty. Yet symbolism falters in the face of persistence. Too many records, too many physical traces, too much recurrence through generations. A pattern like that doesn't survive by myth alone. It needs soil, time, and something deeper, a will beneath the earth that refuses erasure. Today, the only marker near the original site is a rusted fence post bearing a faded sign. Private property, no trespassing. But those who ignore it say that when the storms gather, the field begins to hum, a vibration so low you feel it in your ribs. The air thickens and the smell of iron returns unmistakable. Some claim to see two faint figures at the far edge of the valley, standing perfectly still until lightning flashes. Then they're gone, always gone before the thunder answers. Skeptics call it illusion, light refracted through rain. But locals know better. They call it remembrance. In Deepwater's story, there is no neat resolution, no justice served. The brothers' cellar has become both tomb and mirror, a place where human cruelty fermented until the land itself absorbed it. Each new generation uncovers it not as discovery, but as repetition. Every dig, every storm, every curious mind that dares to unearth what was buried meets the same quiet resistance. The earth does not want to speak, but it will not forget, and in that refusal, Missouri's oldest wound remains open. If there is meaning in the tale of the 7-foot brothers, it lies not in their evil, but in their endurance. What they built beneath that farmhouse, whether dungeon, workshop, or shrine, was less a structure than a statement. That power left unchecked will root itself into the ground and wait for rain. The cellar is no longer merely theirs. It belongs to time, to secrecy, to all who have vanished without reason. Each storm that rolls over the Osage carries their echoes, deep and resonant like hammer strikes on limestone, and each flash of lightning briefly illuminates what Missouri has spent more than a century trying to bury. The outline of two tall shadows still keeping watch beneath the floodplain. By the time the 21st century settled into its rhythm of satellites and surveillance, Missouri's Osage Basin remained stubbornly opaque. Satellite imagery captured every crop line, every drainage route, yet the Deepwater region refused clarity. Clouds formed there even on clear days, a soft blur in every overhead frame. It was as if the land had learned the trick of erasing itself. Geologists marked it as persistent atmospheric distortion, but local pilots knew better. They said that when you flew over the basin, your compass swayed. Not wildly, just enough to whisper that something down there still disturbed the field of measurement. The story of the 7-foot brothers, once confined to yellowing newspaper clippings and old women's cautionary tales, now existed in two worlds, one of legend and one of data. Both told the same truth, that Missouri had never finished burying its ghosts. In 2019, a team of archivists from St. Louis University undertook a digital preservation project involving 19th-century coroner reports. Their intention was purely bureaucratic, to scan, categorize, and upload fragile documents before they decayed beyond recovery. Among them, in a brittle folder labeled Deepwater Township, Henry County, 1886-1888, they found several fragmented ledgers. The handwriting was small and careful, the ink rust-colored with age. The names listed were almost illegible, Mary B., Alice C., Ruth Ann G., but the cause of death column was left blank. Instead, each entry bore a single symbol, a circle with 2 vertical slashes running through it. The archivist, puzzled, traced the notation across other counties and discovered the same mark appearing sporadically through Missouri records until 1902. Its meaning was never officially explained. One researcher, cross-referencing militia ledgers, realized the symbol matched that of an early Osage boundary stamp, a mark used to designate contested land. Somehow, by human hand or by bureaucratic drift, the vanished women had been recorded not as citizens but as territory. The discovery reignited public interest. A small production company proposed a documentary titled Below the Floodline, blending archival investigation with regional folklore. Crews arrived in Missouri with high-definition cameras, drones, and ground scanners. The director, a quiet man named Ellis McCall, had grown up near the basin. He told reporters he wanted to let the land speak for itself. For weeks, the team filmed interviews with historians, descendants of early settlers, and local farmers. Most were polite but wary, repeating the same advice: don't dig. The film's crew dismissed it as superstition. They secured permits, marked excavation grids, and began scanning near the suspected location of the cellar. The first 2 days yielded nothing but clay and old metal. On the third, their instruments registered a perfectly rectangular anomaly, 13 feet beneath the surface, measuring roughly 30 by 20 feet. It wasn't geological. It was built. Ellis ordered a small trench opened at the anomaly's edge. Within hours, they unearthed a section of limestone wall mortared with a black substance that seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it. When touched, it left a residue on the skin that smelled faintly of iron and rot. A team member jokingly called it cellar tar. That night, rain began to fall. Sharp, sudden, and heavy. The crew packed up, planning to resume in the morning. But when they returned, the trench had filled completely, not just with water but with fine silt, as though the earth had poured itself back in. Their instruments now showed nothing below, only compacted soil. Ellis reviewed the overnight footage from a camera left facing the site. For 5 hours after the rain began, the screen showed only darkness and mist. Then at 2:13 a.m., a brief flash of lightning illuminated the field. 2 elongated shapes stood at the trench's edge, motionless. They weren't trees. The wind bent the grass around them. The next bolt came 5 seconds later, and the field was empty again. Production halted. Some crew members left immediately, refusing payment. The footage was never aired, though fragments leaked online. Grainy, half-lit, argued over endlessly in forums dedicated to unsolved history. The state confiscated what remained under the pretense of land preservation protocol. The film's existence became rumor. Ellis McCall withdrew from public life, reportedly moving to the Pacific Northwest. When a journalist reached out to him in 2022, he sent only a single sentence in reply: "It's still breathing down there." Today, the Osage Basin sits in uneasy silence. No one farms that patch of land anymore. It's been designated a restricted wetland reserve. Yet hunters claim that during certain storms, they hear what sounds like distant hammering carried through the rain. Some say it's thunder echoing against the bluffs. Others refuse to explain. Every few years, after especially heavy flooding, something surfaces. Small bones, fragments of porcelain, twisted metal that looks like tools. The county quietly removes them. Official statements call them historic debris from pre-1900 homesteads. But the debris never matches other sites from that period. Too heavy, too deliberate. The Cellar has become a parable among scholars who study the moral geography of America's frontier era. It encapsulates how violence sinks into landscape, how crime becomes sediment. The brothers themselves are almost mythic. Nobody can confirm their true names, and no official census records men of their height or trade living in Deepwater Township. Some theorists believe the 7-foot brothers was a metaphor used by local women to describe authority. Tall men, towering not in stature but in power. Others insist the Gant name appears too consistently across oral records to dismiss entirely. Yet whether literal or symbolic, their legacy is measurable. A century of absence radiating outward like a ripple through time. Those who have studied the case closely often remark on the uncanny parallels between the Cellar legend and the broader history of America's late 19th century, the years when railroads expanded, towns drowned beneath progress, and those on society's margins vanished without inquiry. The Cellar, in that sense, is not unique. It is simply one of the few places where the ground remembers exactly how many it took. Floods preserve as much as they destroy. The Osage River's cycles, swelling, bursting, receding, acted like a dark archivist, sealing human cruelty within its sedimentary layers. Each time the valley floods anew, it opens a little, exhales a little, offers just enough to remind the living what the past costs to forget. And still people go looking. Every few years, a fresh group of investigators or thrill seekers arrives with their scanners, their microphones, their unshakable belief that truth can be extracted like ore. Most leave disappointed or changed. One climatologist who placed seismic sensors in the region reported an inexplicable rhythmic pulse beneath the soil, repeating every 48 seconds. When modeled, the waveform resembled the beat of a human heart slowed to a crawl. The data was published, then quietly retracted. His equipment, he said later, didn't malfunction. It listened. For the residents of Missouri's backcountry, the story no longer belongs to horror alone. It has become inheritance, a reminder that what is done in silence never stays buried. Elders still tell the tale to their grandchildren, sometimes as warning, sometimes as lament. They describe the Cellar as a wound the earth learned to close over itself. They say that on the night of the Great Flood, when the brothers' house collapsed and the river rose to claim it, the water turned black as tar and carried away not just the bodies, but the memory of the voices that cried out below. Yet memory, like silt, always finds its way back to the surface. So the story endures, not as spectacle but as testament, a record written in mud and rumor, in names half-remembered and faces no one dares to paint. The 7-foot brothers remain unproven, their cellar unconfirmed, and yet the valley continues to hum with the quiet insistence of something unresolved. Perhaps they never existed as men. Perhaps they were only the physical shape of a truth too large to face, that power, when unchecked, always digs downward. That history, when unacknowledged, always floods back, and that the land, more faithful than any archive, never forgets the weight it has had to bear. When storms roll over Missouri now, and the thunder sinks deep into the Osage Plain, there are those who swear they can feel the echo beneath their feet. A low, steady rhythm like hammering or heartbeats or both. They pause, listening, and wonder which is worse, that something might still be alive down there, or that it's only the earth itself remembering what humanity taught it to do. Keep secrets, hold the dead, and never ever let them go. Let them go.